The music room at Riverside Academy was cold that January morning. Mrs. Eleanor Hampton stood at the front of the class, her gray hair pulled back in its usual severe ponytail, her pearl earrings catching the winter light. She was 63 years old and had taught piano at this private school for 35 years. She had standards, high standards. And she believed that some children simply did not belong at a school like Riverside. 8-year-old Sophie Brennan sat at her desk, her blonde hair neatly pulled back, her school uniform pressed and proper. But inside, her stomach churned with dread. She knew what was coming. It happened every Tuesday during music class, and today would be no different. Behind her sat 4 boys in navy blue uniforms. They whispered and snickered, waiting for the show. They always waited for the show. Mrs. Hampton's voice cut through the room like ice. "Miss Brennan, please come to the piano." Sophie's hands gripped the edge of her desk. She didn't move. "I said come to the piano, Sophie." Mrs. Hampton's finger pointed toward the grand piano that dominated the front of the room. "We're all waiting." The other children shifted in their seats. Some looked uncomfortable. Others leaned forward eagerly. This had become a weekly ritual, and everyone knew their part. Sophie stood slowly, her legs shaking. She walked to the piano bench and sat down, her small hands hovering over the keys. She could feel everyone's eyes on her back. She could hear the boys already starting to laugh. Mrs. Hampton stood beside her, arms crossed. "Play the scale we've been practicing, Sophie. Surely even you can manage that much by now." Sophie's fingers found the keys. She pressed down on middle C, then D, then E. Her hand trembled as she continued up the scale. F, G, A, B, and back down. "Again," Mrs. Hampton said coldly, with proper form this time. "Look at your posture, shoulders back, wrists up. You play like a child who's never had a proper lesson in her life." Sophie's face burned. She tried again. This time her finger slipped on the F, hitting F sharp instead. The sour note hung in the air. The boys burst out laughing. "She can't even play a scale," one of them whispered loud enough for everyone to hear. Mrs. Hampton shook her head, that familiar expression of disappointment settling over her features. "You see, class, this is what happens when a school lowers its standards. When we accept students based on scholarship programs rather than merit. Miss Brennan has been here for 5 months, and she still cannot perform the most basic exercises." Sophie's eyes filled with tears. She stared at the keys, willing herself not to cry. Not here. Not in front of everyone. "Perhaps you should stick to schools more suited to your background, dear," Mrs. Hampton continued, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Music requires breeding, refinement, natural talent. It cannot be taught to just anyone." The door to the music room opened. Principal Richard Morrison stepped inside, a tall, distinguished man in his late 50s. Beside him walked a woman Sophie had never seen before. She was younger than Mrs. Hampton, maybe in her early 50s, with kind eyes and a warm smile. "Ah, Mrs. Hampton," Principal Morrison said. "Perfect timing. This is Mrs. Victoria Lang. She's considering a position as our new assistant music director. I thought she might observe your class today." Mrs. Hampton's expression tightened, but she managed a professional smile. "Of course. We were just working on basic scales with some of our more challenged students." Mrs. Lang walked closer to the piano, her eyes on Sophie. The little girl looked up at her, and something passed between them. Recognition, understanding. "May I?" Mrs. Lang asked, gesturing to the piano bench. Mrs. Hampton stepped back. "Certainly." Mrs. Lang sat down beside Sophie. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Sophie," the girl whispered. "That's a beautiful name. Sophie means wisdom." "Did you know that?" Mrs. Lang's voice was gentle. "I'm Victoria, and I'd like to hear you play something for me. Not a scale, something you want to play. Something you feel." Sophie looked at her with wide, uncertain eyes. "I don't know any real songs, just scales and exercises." "Then play what you feel right now," Mrs. Lang said. "Music isn't about what you know, it's about what you need to say when words aren't enough." Mrs. Hampton cleared her throat. "Mrs. Lang, I hardly think this is appropriate. The child needs to master the fundamentals before we indulge in creative exploration." But Mrs. Lang ignored her, her attention focused entirely on Sophie. "Go ahead, honey. Just close your eyes and play what your heart needs to say." Sophie closed her eyes. Her hands found the keys, and then something extraordinary happened. She began to play. It wasn't a scale. It wasn't an exercise from a book. It was raw and simple and achingly beautiful. A melody that spoke of loneliness and longing and the desperate need to belong. Her fingers moved across the keys with an instinct she didn't know she possessed, finding harmonies that made the piano sing. The room fell completely silent. The snickering stopped. The whispering ceased. Even Mrs. Hampton stood frozen, her mouth slightly open. Sophie played for 2 minutes, maybe 3. When she finished, her hands fell to her lap and she opened her eyes, confused by the silence. Mrs. Lang had tears running down her cheeks. "Sophie, who taught you to play like that?" "No one," Sophie whispered. "I just hear the music in my head sometimes, at night, when I'm trying to sleep. But I'm not allowed to play it. Mrs. Hampton says I have to practice my scales." Mrs. Lang turned to look at Mrs. Hampton, and the warmth had left her eyes. "How long has this child been in your class?" 5 months, Mrs. Hampton said stiffly, "and in that time she has failed to master even the most basic technical skills. Because you've been teaching her." "The wrong way," Mrs. Lang said, standing up. Her voice was firm but controlled. "This child has perfect pitch. Do you understand what that means? She has a gift that maybe 1 in 10,000 people possess, and you've been crushing it under scales and criticism." Principal Morrison stepped forward. "Mrs. Hampton, perhaps we should discuss this in my office." But Mrs. Lang wasn't finished. She looked around at the other students, then back at Mrs. Hampton. "I grew up poor. My father was a janitor. My mother cleaned houses. We couldn't afford private piano lessons. I learned to play on an old upright piano at the community center. And you know what my first teacher told me? She told me that music didn't care where I came from. It only cared about what I had inside me." She put her hand on Sophie's shoulder. "This little girl has more music inside her than most people will ever possess. And you've spent 5 months trying to humiliate her into quitting. Why? Because her parents aren't wealthy? Because she's here on scholarship?" Mrs. Hampton's face went white, then red. "How dare you? I have been teaching at this institution for 3 decades. "Then maybe it's time you remembered why you started," Mrs. Lang said quietly. Principal Morrison cleared his throat. "Mrs. Hampton, my office. Now, Mrs. Lang, would you mind finishing this class period?" As Mrs. Hampton left, her back rigid with fury, Mrs. Lang sat back down beside Sophie. The little girl was shaking, overwhelmed by everything that had just happened. "Am I in trouble?" Sophie asked. "No, sweetheart, you're not in trouble." Mrs. Lang squeezed her hand gently. "But I need to ask you something. Do you want to learn piano? Really learn? Not just scales and exercises, but how to let that music in your head come out through your fingers?" Sophie nodded, unable to speak. "Then we're going to work together," Mrs. Lang said. "I'm going to take this job, and you're going to be my student, and together, we're going to show everyone what real music sounds like." The boys behind them had gone very quiet. One of them raised his hand hesitantly. "Yes?" Mrs. Lang asked. "That was really good," the boy said. "What Sophie played, it was really good." Mrs. Lang smiled. "Yes, it was, and you know what else? Every single one of you has music inside you too. We just have to help you find it." Over the next 4 years, Sophie studied under Mrs. Victoria Lang. Not just scales and technical exercises, though those came too, but also composition, improvisation, the kind of playing that came from the soul rather than the page. By the time Sophie was 12, she had performed at Carnegie Hall. By 15, she'd won the National Youth Piano Competition. By 18, she'd been accepted to Juilliard with a full scholarship. And every single performance, whether in a small recital hall or a grand concert stage, Sophie dedicated to the woman who'd seen her when everyone else looked away. To Mrs. Lang, who taught her that talent has nothing to do with where you come from, and everything to do with the courage to let your true voice be heard. As for Mrs. Hampton, she retired that spring. Some said she jumped before she was pushed. Others said she'd simply realized her time had passed. But those who were in the music room that cold January morning never forgot what happened. They never forgot the lesson that sometimes the people we dismiss are the ones with the most to teach us. And they never forgot Sophie Brennan, the little girl whose music silenced the doubters and proved that genius doesn't ask permission. It just needs someone brave enough to give it space to grow. If this story touched your heart, please like and share it with someone who needs to remember that they're more than other people's opinions of them. Subscribe for more stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things when given a chance. And leave a comment telling us about a teacher or mentor who believed in you when others didn't. Your story might inspire someone who's struggling to keep going today.